Welcome to This is Getting Old, Moving Towards an Age-Friendly World. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor, and today we're going to be talking about the new drug for Alzheimer's disease, known as Aduhelm or Aducanumab. I'm joined by Howard Gleckman, who's a senior fellow with the Urban Institute. So welcome, Howard, and before we get going, maybe you can just introduce yourself.
Sure, Melissa, thank you very much. Great to be with you. So I am a researcher and a writer at the Urban Institute, which is a policy research organization in Washington, D.C. I specialize in two areas. One is tax policy, but what's interesting to your audience today is I also work in aging policy issues. I was a journalist for a long time and actually did a career switch about 20 years ago when I became a caregiver. I was a caregiver for my father-in-law and for my dad, and got very interested in long-term care and aging issues. Realized that we didn't really have a system for caring for older adults, and got very interested in seeing what I could do to help create a system. So that's what I do.
Okay, so in the context of this new drug, I think probably some things that people need to know, like at a basic level, is that Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of Alzheimer's disease, of dementia. So dementia is the big umbrella term. Alzheimer's is about 60 to 80% of the cases. And then you have Lewy body, vascular, there are a lot of different types, and there's a lot of mixed dementias. And one of the things that happens with the brain is it begins to shrink, and these things develop called plaques and tangles, or beta or amyloid and tau, and they're considered toxic to the brain. And so over the past 30 years, there have been a lot of theories about how to treat this condition or slow down the progression. And right now we don't have anything that does that. So we do have 3 drugs right now that inhibit cholinesterase, which will improve memory for a short period of time, but again, doesn't slow down the disease process. So tell me how this drug, like what it aimed to do and how it's administered and how it's supposed to work.
So the first thing to remember is what you said is very important. This only affects certain people with Alzheimer's disease. As far as we know, there's been no research at all on whether or not it has any effect on people with other forms of dementia. So this really is a story about a drug that may or may not help a subset of people with Alzheimer's disease, and those are people with early stage or mild forms of Alzheimer's. So as you said, there is a lot of controversy in the research world about what causes Alzheimer's disease. We know that people who have Alzheimer's disease have this material on their brain, which is called amyloid beta. So there is what a researcher would say is a correlation. We know that if you have Alzheimer's disease, you have high levels of amyloid beta in your brain. But we don't know whether those high levels of amyloid beta cause Alzheimer's disease. We just know they're there with people who have it. So for decades, there has been just tremendous amount of work looking for a drug that would either delay the onset of Alzheimer's or even cure it. And nothing has worked. As you said, some drugs which have some modest temporary effect on memory loss, but nothing really to treat or cure Alzheimer's disease. There have been many tries. Drug companies have spent massive amounts of money, and all of the drugs have failed. They've either been too dangerous or they've just not done anybody any good.
Yeah, so speaking of cost, so Biogen created this drug, and it's supposed to target the beta amyloid and decrease the amount of beta amyloid in the brain. But it cost them $18 billion to develop this drug. So, I mean, they've put some significant money into it.
They really have. And you can just imagine there's 6 million people in the country right now who have Alzheimer's disease, and probably another 2 or 3 million who have other forms of dementia. If you could create a drug that would actually cure or delay the onset of these diseases, you would be very rich. There's a lot of money in this. And that's part of the motivation of the Food and Drug Administration in this story, which troubles a lot of people. So what happened is Biogen, the company that was developing this drug, attempted a couple of trials. One trial showed some success, but modest success. The other trial showed no success at all. It showed no benefit at all to the people in the trial. And Biogen stopped the trials. And then about a year ago, they went back to FDA and said, well, you know what? We think we still ought to get approval for this drug. FDA went through a very complicated process. What FDA often does with some of these very highly specialized drugs is it turns the analysis over to a special panel of people who are expert in that particular drug. And that's what happened here. The panel did its research. It looked at the trials. It looked at all the evidence. And it unanimously recommended to the FDA that it not approve this drug. Instead, it suggested that Biogen go through another trial, and this time go through the entire process and come up with some results. And then they come back and look at the results and see whether or not it actually worked. The FDA rejected the recommendation of that expert panel, which is very unusual. 3 members of the expert panel resigned as a result of that. When the FDA approved this drug a couple of months ago, it did it in an interesting way. Usually when the FDA approves a drug, it does it because it concludes that it has a clinical benefit to the patients, to people with the condition, that outweighs any risks. They didn't say that in this case. What they said was, and I'm going to actually read it because it's interesting language, that they said that the drug could have a positive effect, and the quote is, on a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict the clinical benefit to patients. So what does that mean in English? What it means is that the FDA was—
I don't know.
and you're the clinician and you don't know. What it means is that the FDA was convinced that Aduhelm has some positive effect on reducing the amount of amyloid beta in the brain. And therefore, it's reasonably likely, it is possible, that by doing that, it would have a future clinical benefit to patients. So there's no evidence that it actually benefits patients, but there is evidence that it affects this amyloid beta that might have some benefit for patients. Now they did that, it was interesting. They did that by making a comparison to what they did some years ago with cancer drugs. Cancer drugs were in the same situation 30 years ago. There was lots of research and nobody was getting anywhere. And the FDA did the same thing. They approved the drug and then a series of drugs, betting that by approving the drug companies would have more of a financial incentive to continue this line of research. And by continuing this line of research, they would get positive benefits. And of course, with cancer, it worked. All of these immunotherapy drugs, we've had a revolution in pharmaceutical treatment of cancer. The FDA said, well, we're going to try the same thing this time. The problem, of course, is they succeeded with immunotherapy. There's no reason to believe they're going to succeed with this. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. So that's what the FDA did. They initially approved the drug without any conditions. There was a tremendous amount of pushback from the medical profession, from researchers who said, hey, wait a minute, all you did here was, these were incomplete studies, but the studies you did were only on people with early stage dementia. You didn't do research on older adults at all, no research on people over 80, no research on people in nursing homes. So how can you possibly approve this drug for everybody with Alzheimer's disease? So the FDA and Biogen actually rethought this, and the FDA relabeled the drug and essentially said, well, we recommend this drug, or we are permitting the sale of this drug for people with early stage Alzheimer's disease. So they're attempting to limit the number of people who might be able to take this drug and have some benefit from it.
So we've talked about the fact that, we really don't have any drugs that will prevent or slow down or cure Alzheimer's disease. And, so what do you think maybe is another reason that the FDA may have approved this drug?
So the FDA was pretty explicit about that as well. They acknowledge the fact that this is a terrible disease. There's no treatment for it, and people are desperate. And the FDA essentially said, we understand that, and we want to make this available. This may not be as successful a drug as we hope, and it normally would be if FDA gave an approval. But given the fact that people with dementia have no other options, we want to give them the opportunity to have access to this drug. The other thing you said, which is very interesting, is it's also really true that there are many people with early stage dementia that goes undiagnosed, and the research that had been done for many years, which failed, started at the time when people had diagnosed disease, when they were in moderate stage or even advanced stage. It never went anywhere. The research was a dead end. Many of the researchers who were following this train said, well, what we need to do is we need to give the drug to people earlier. If we could give it to them before they're symptomatic, then maybe it's going to work. That raises some very interesting ethical questions. Can you give an experimental drug to somebody who's not sick? And what kind of disclosure do you have to provide, and how do you identify people? It raises a bunch of very complicated issues, and really that have really not been resolved in this approval.
Right, and part of that has to do with how Alzheimer's disease is even diagnosed. I mean, it's a diagnosis of exclusion, which means you have to rule everything else out. And there's this other player in early Alzheimer's called mild cognitive impairment, and not all people with MCI transition into Alzheimer's disease, and we don't know or understand that mechanism of why that happens, why some people transition and some people don't. So then you could be potentially giving a drug to a group of people that would have never even gotten Alzheimer's disease. I mean, that's just how much we don't know about this disease. And I think what makes it different from other chronic conditions is the blood-brain barrier. How do you get the drug through that blood-brain barrier that's meant to protect the brain when the toxins are developing in the brain? So it's very complex situation. And then, for this particular drug, it's a monthly injection. And, so let's talk a little bit about why that's different, kind of from a payment perspective, and go from there.
So, first of all, the bottom line that people should know is this drug is enormously expensive. Biogen is going to charge $56,000 a year for this drug. And because it's not a cure, you have to take this drug every year for the rest of your life. So it is enormously expensive. It's unusual in that it is a Part B drug. It's a Medicare Part B drug. B as in boy. Most of us are familiar with the Part D drugs, which are the pills that we buy in the pharmacy. Part B drugs are usually injectables or infusion drugs. This is an infusion. You generally get it at a physician's office or an infusion center or a hospital or something like that.
By nurses.
Yeah. So this is a little unusual in that sense. For Medicare, this is an enormous challenge. Medicare spends right now only about $40 billion a year on Part B drugs, on all the Part B drugs, all the cancer drugs, all the Part B drugs. They only spend a total of about $40 billion a year. This drug, if only a third of the people who are eligible to take it took it, would cost over $50 billion, almost $60 billion. So it would completely blow the budget of Medicare's Part B drug program. So it is enormously expensive. It's also important to remember that these drugs come with a 20% copay. So if Biogen charges $56,000 a year for the drug, essentially what it means is consumers, people on Medicare, would still have to pay about $11,000 out of pocket and Medicare would pay the rest if Medicare pays for it, which is, we can get into that in a minute, but that's another issue. So it's enormously expensive because it's an infusion, it's very disruptive, and it has side effects. This is like almost any drug, it comes with side effects, including swelling of the brain and other issues. So, going back to what you said before, what we're going to do here is we're going to give a potentially dangerous drug to people who have no symptoms of a disease, or maybe have symptoms of a disease that's different than the disease this drug is intended to treat. It's also important to keep in mind that a lot of the more contemporary research into Alzheimer's suggests that it may not be one disease at all, that even Alzheimer's may be many different diseases that are, as you suggested, sort of, we couldn't think of what else it was, so let's just label it Alzheimer's. And neurologists who are treating this disease have discovered that different sorts of non-pharmaceutical treatments work differently for people who are diagnosed with this broad scope of dementia or Alzheimer's. And it may very well be that that's because some people have a different disease, that Alzheimer's may not be the same disease for everybody. And that's why some of these non-pharmaceutical interventions may actually work better for some patients than others.
Right. And part of that is because we really can't get a definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease at this point in time until autopsy.
That's right, until you're dead. That's right.
Right. And, so I think from the public's perspective, they get frustrated that it takes so long for them to get a diagnosis, but really it's just a best guess. We can look at your brain and see if it's shrunk, because atrophy of the brain is one of the things that we can see, but that's not going to be happening all that early in the disease. And, the rest of it is screening and doing and ruling every other thing out, possible. So, so let's talk a little bit about payment for this between CMS and the VA and kind of private insurance companies.
So as I said, it's very expensive. It's $56,000. In order to qualify to take the drug, you have to have what's called a PET scan. It's a very sophisticated image. That costs $5,000 or $6,000. And nobody pays for that. You've got to pay for that out of pocket. So that adds to the cost. So it is, as I said, it is a Medicare Part B drug. Medicare can pay for this, but Medicare doesn't have to pay for this. Medicare is engaged right now in a relatively unusual process. It's not unknown, but it's relatively unusual, which is called the National Coverage Determination. And that's bureaucratese for Medicare is taking comments from the public, from experts, from other people to determine whether or not they are going to pay for this drug and under what circumstances they're going to pay for the drug. So this national coverage determination could range from we're not going to pay for it at all to we're going to pay for it in every case, which is I think unlikely, to a sort of middle ground, which is maybe we will pay for it if it's indicated for a specific patient in a specific stage of the disease. So maybe we will pay for it for patients who are in early stage, who've been diagnosed to be in early stage Alzheimer's. And maybe we'll review the payment after, say, a year to determine whether or not there's any evidence that this is actually creating any clinical improvement for the patient. So there's a lot of different ways that Medicare can approach this, but it would be a mistake to assume that Medicare is just going to pay for it. It's going to take Medicare about 9 months to do this determination. It just started. It will be finished sometime next spring. In the meantime, we have this very strange system where each of Medicare's 12 regions is allowed to make its own decision about whether or not to pay for this. So you could live in Ohio and the regional governance of Medicare will say, yes, we will pay for it. You could live in Georgia and the region there may say, no, we won't. And I think everybody recognizes that this is a chaotic system. This is not going to work, which is why Medicare is doing this regional coverage determination. Some of the other important players, and let me also say that probably 80% of people who would qualify for this drug are on Medicare. So Medicare is by far the biggest player here. But there are others. You mentioned the Veterans Administration. The Veterans Administration has done its own analysis, and it's concluded that it is not going to be in what it calls its formulary, its list of approved drugs. So if you're a veteran and you want to take this drug, you're in VA care, you can take it if you can get it, but the VA is not going to pay for it, and VA doctors are not going to prescribe it. Then there's a question of private insurance. Private insurance is sort of holding its cards pretty close to its chest right now. A few of the state Blue Cross insurance companies, and as you know, the Blues are sort of divided by states. Some of the Blue Cross companies have already said they are not paying for this. Blue Cross in Michigan, Blue Cross in a few other states, based in North Carolina, have basically said we're not paying. Other major insurers like Humana and United Healthcare have said we're going to wait and see what Medicare says, and we're going to make a decision then. The other issue about payment that I think is important, you alluded to this before, is there's an organization called the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, the ICER. It's an independent organization that does its own review of pharmaceuticals. It has reached two very interesting and important conclusions. The first one is it does not think this drug should have been approved by the FDA. It does not think there was sufficient evidence of clinical benefit. The other thing it did is it analyzed the price of this drug. So Biogen is charging $56,000. ICER thinks that the drug probably should be sold for somewhere between $3,000 and $8,000. So Biogen is charging way more than an independent analysis thinks it should. Why is it doing that? Well, as you said, it cost a lot of money to develop the drug. And there are a number of other very similar drugs that are in the pipeline. Biogen's been approved first. It wants to make as much money as it can before competitive drugs get on the market, which will presumably drive the price down. So there's a funny economics going on here, but this drug is just enormously expensive. It also, of course, is betting that Medicare will pay for it. If Medicare chooses to not pay, I suspect that the price of the drug will come down a lot. So that's kind of going to be another interesting piece to watch.
Yeah. So we've kind of talked about the FDA approval process, or the clinical trial results, the FDA approval process. We've talked a little bit about the economics. So now let's talk about how this is impacting, the clinicians and the consumers of today who have maybe heard a little bit about the drug. Maybe, it's kind of like I had not watched regular television until I went to my parents' house a couple of weeks ago, and I was just like, oh my God, look at every commercial. I mean, every commercial break included something about a pharmaceutical company. And, I know when I practice clinically, patients would come in and say, hey, I feel like I need X, Y, and Z drug. And I'm like, what do you think you need it for? Well, I don't know, but that commercial looked really good. I'm like,
this is something that is really troubling clinicians. I've heard from a number of physicians who are very, very bothered by this because they are, to use the common phrase, the tip of the spear here. They're the people, exactly what you said. Their patients are going to come to them and say, I want Aduhelm. And they're the ones who are going to have to say to their patient, it's not appropriate for you. Yes, you have some memory loss, but it's not Alzheimer's disease. Maybe it's Lewy body disease, or maybe it's vascular dementia, or maybe we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But this drug is not appropriate. And the fear that physicians have is that patients will just say, all right, I'll go to another doctor. And clinically, that's bad. And it's also bad for business, frankly. So they don't want to be in a position where they have to explain to a patient why it is that, yes, the FDA has approved this drug. And of course, in the context of COVID, we've just heard all this stuff about why you should believe the FDA when the FDA approves a drug. So now you've got somebody who said, well, when you told me to get the COVID shot, you told me to believe the FDA. Now I'm coming to you and saying, well, the FDA approved this Alzheimer's drug. Why won't you give me this? Why won't you give this to me? And that's a very long conversation that physicians really don't want to have.
Well, and they have 15 minutes.
They have 15 minutes. They don't have the time. They don't really, I mean, they don't really have the research. They're not going to read all these research reports on this drug. They just know essentially what we do, that it may or may not work. So it's a real challenge for them. For patients, this is a very difficult situation. If you have a loved one who's got dementia, you're desperate to do something. And now here is this FDA approved drug and you want it. And one of the things you need to think about, for those of us who don't have unlimited resources, which is nearly all of us, there's an opportunity cost here. If this drug is available, can you afford to spend $56,000 on this drug? Can you afford to spend even $11,000 a year on this drug? And think about what you can't do if you just spent $56,000 on this drug. Think about if you have, let's say, your mom has got dementia. For $56,000, you can buy a lot of time of a home health aide. You can buy a lot of adult day. You can buy wheelchair ramps. You can get grab bars in the bathroom, and you could still have $20,000 or $25,000 left over. You're in a situation where you've got to make this terrible choice. Do I want to buy this drug that may or may not help? Or do I want to spend my limited resources on services that I know do help?
Right.
And how do you make that choice? How do you do that? So a lot of what bothers me about the FDA's decision is it's giving people false hope. It is making them to believe that if they scrape together somehow all of this money, that there's going to be this magic cure for this disease. And we just don't have the evidence that that's true.
Well, in fact, from what I've read, in 14 clinical trials, there was not an improvement in cognition. So they did find significantly reduced levels of the beta amyloid, but there were no significant changes in the person's mini-mental state exam, which is the screening tool that that's the gold standard that clinicians use. They should use it in conjunction with the MoCA because it tests things slightly differently. But there just really isn't any evidence to support that this drug works. And in fact, some of the people in the placebo arm of these drugs did better than the ones who got the drug. So there is some indication that it could be harmful. And my recommendation, just clinically and as a scientist, would be, this might be one you don't want to be a front runner on. And again, like you said, it's not just $56,000 this year; it's every year. When it's not going to slow things down. I mean, it's really no better. It has no better outcome than the oral medications that we're using right now, called anticholinesterase inhibitors, which are a Part D drug, and just don't have. But even those have demonstrated that they will slow progression, but it doesn't alter the course. So at a certain point, the drugs become ineffective. And it's just like with my grandmother, I told my mom, I was like, if she's having symptoms, I mean, she has mild Alzheimer's, but we took her off the medication, and she actually did better because she wasn't sick all the time, with the side effects. And so it is a complex situation, but I appreciate that you actually spelled it out very clearly. So any other final thoughts before we go?
I think the last message, for physicians is be very, very careful about prescribing this and think about the consequences and spend a little time, talking to your patients about what the diagnosis, if you have diagnosed Alzheimer's, what that diagnosis really means, what the choices are for patients and their families. It's interesting that the Academy of Neurology just a month or so ago approved a new set of ethics guidelines for dealing with patients with dementia, with patients with any dementia. And those ethics guidelines actually require neurologists to spend that time with patients and their families and walk them through this. You're right. Nobody's paying them for that extra time, but it's really important that they do it. If you are a patient or if you're a care partner of a patient, I think it's just very important to think about the choice here. And even if you can find a doctor who's going to prescribe this, is it really appropriate? And don't let yourself be sucked in by all of the publicity that was out there and all of the marketing that's out there now about this. You have to think about whether it's got any benefit. And as you said, the clinical benefit is at best uncertain. You have to think about the side effects, which can be very severe. And you have to think about where that money otherwise would go. And the clear benefits of some of that spending on things like home health aides or adult day programs, that sort of thing. So, you might instinctively say, well, here is this drug. I'm just going to go grab it. I'm going to just go for it because there's nothing else. But stop and think about that, and stop and think about the consequences of taking this. I think you put it very well. You don't want to be an early adapter. I think the best thing for all of us to do here is sit down and watch what happens over the next several years and see whether or not there is some evidence of clinical benefit. I would not be surprised if Biogen this approval actually does require them to do another study, but the drug is approved in the meantime. So I think I would not be surprised if 2 or 3 years down the road, when we get the results of the next study, things don't change significantly from where they are today. But we're just going to have to see.
Right. So I just wanted to, for people who want to learn more about Alzheimer's disease, 2 resources they can check out are each year the Alzheimer's Association puts out their Alzheimer's disease facts and figures. And so the 2021 version is out, and on page 6 and 7 is table 1, explains the different types of dementia and the characteristics of that. And then the NIH, I'm also going to link that on my website there's a video that actually shows what these, the plaques and tangles look like as they develop in the brain. And I remember just being like, that would have been so helpful, like when I was in college, just to understand how all of this stuff works. So I'm going to put those 2 resources on my website, melissabphd.com. And how could people follow you and your blog around following this over time?
So let me also suggest one other resource for people with dementia or care partners of people with dementia. It's the Dementia Action Alliance. And they provide an enormous amount of useful information about caring for somebody with the disease. The Alzheimer's Association is focused very much on finding a treatment for the disease. And in fact, they lobbied very hard for the FDA to approve Aduhelm. Dementia Action Alliance is really geared towards helping people with dementia and their care partners live the best life they possibly can with the disease. As far as finding me and what I talk about, I do a column every week for Forbes.com. And you can just go to Howard Gleckman at Forbes.com. You can go to my website, which is howardgleckman.com, and also see what I'm writing about long-term care issues.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you being with me today to talk about this mouthful of a drug, even though it's given as an infusion. All right. So thank you very much. And that's it.
Melissa, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for tuning in to This is Getting Old, Moving Towards an Age-Friendly World. I'm your host, Melissa Batchelor, and if you'd like to learn more, you can check out my other episodes on my YouTube channel by subscribing and ringing the bell to get immediate notifications when new content comes out. In addition, you can also find the audio version of the podcast on Amazon Music, Spotify, iTunes, and Stitcher. Please feel free to leave an honest review because more reviews mean more awareness of the podcast. If you have a comment or a question, you can visit my website, melissabphd.com. Go to the Contact Melissa tab, and you can leave me a voice message. You never know, it might just include your question or your comment in an upcoming episode.